Hello, Mr. Justin Trudeau, and welcome to my video. Today, I will be discussing the Royal Proclamation Wampum Belt design. So what is the purpose of the Royal Proclamation of 2022? In brief, it's created to honor and strengthen the relationship between Canada and Indigenous nations and bring forward the current and pressing issues breaking apart our path towards reconciliation. So if you look at the screen, here it is in full. If you take notice of the dominant color in the background, it's purple. And what it signifies is the desire to achieve mutual respect and agreement. And overall, it's showing many of the pressing issues that should be addressed, including issues related to land, language erosion, water, residential schools and burial sites, and missing murdered Indigenous women and children. In this video, I'm going to dive into what each design symbol on the wampum belt means and how it relates to the issues and how we can move forward as well. So first, what is more important than water? If you look at the screen, there's an infinity sign. And this infinity sign symbolizes a call to action on the water crisis that Indigenous nations are experiencing across Canada. And if you take notice of the two white integrated rings, those reflect a two-eyed seeing approach. And really, this approach works towards achieving purity, good mind, and everlasting peace. There's also the blue water droplets within the infinity ring, and this sends the message that to achieve water rights, we must follow Indigenous knowledge and research methods. Notice how there's a purple sky as well in the background behind the water droplets. So this is inspired by the Onkiwan belts, and the purple represents a promise to uphold this agreement and actually being committed to restoring the spiritual and cultural connection with the water that Indigenous nations have. I also want to emphasize that Indigenous people view water as far from a commodity. There is a spiritual relationship with the water based on interdependency, reciprocity, respect, and overall acknowledging that water is a living being. The problem, though, is that Indigenous nations are the ones affected by poor water quality, even though it's so important to them. And they're the ones who have to deal with multi-year boil water advisories and vast public health concerns. There's been little, however, to no policy commitment by the Canadian government to address this water crisis. We have promises by the federal government on water management within Indigenous nations, but these promises are underfunded, and so the health risks continue to rise because of the lack of access to clean water. So how can we promote Indigenous people's access to clean water, especially because it is their right? Well, first, water has to be decolonized. This means supporting Indigenous self-determination and Indigenous-led initiatives. And second, accountability is another important goal. So our fiscal plans, they should include Indigenous-led water treatment methods, the active monitoring of Indigenous water facilities, and ensuring Indigenous nations are updated on their water status within each nation. Putting this topic aside, I'm going to talk about the importance of language preservation. So the symbol, it's a circle, and it looks like a sun. So it brings about the issue of language erosion, basically, specifically Indigenous languages. The symbol was inspired by the seating plan of the 50 Confederacy chiefs, and within the circle, there's lines, and this reflects each chief's hand signifying unity. So why a symbol that looks like the sun? Well, like the sun. Languages are believed to be infinite, but it's clearly not the case. Like Wade David said, nearly half of the world's languages have gone extinct, but also we cannot say that Indigenous languages have gone extinct on their own as if it's a natural phenomenon, because it's not. Indigenous languages were destroyed by assimilative policies by the Canadian government, and so the Canadian government is the one responsible for protecting Indigenous languages today by stepping up and making reforms. For example, Indigenous language should be protected just as much as French and English. We can achieve this by mandating that each governmental ministry within Canada conduct regular progress reports on what they're doing to strengthen Indigenous languages. And we can also require that Canadian students attend Indigenous language courses just like they do with French. Only, however, by reform can we nationally recognize Indigenous people's languages and protect them against further erosion. Now I'm going to shift the discussion to the issue of land taking by the Canadian government, and it's a very, very important issue, still arising today. So the symbol here is a tree, and if you look at the tree roots on the wampum belts, it reflects the long history and interconnectedness that Indigenous people have with the land. It all started with the creation stories, and these stories demonstrate the way the land was used by Indigenous nations across generations to live on the land and use the land and perform land stewardship. The land is even connected to Indigenous people's spiritual beliefs, traditional knowledge, and teaching, and it's fundamental to their cultural reproduction. So it's very important, evidently, for Indigenous nations. Yet, the treaties between Indigenous peoples and colonizers, they show that Indigenous people, they never gave the land to the colonizers or allowed them to take it. They merely gave them permission to use the land. So today, problematically, our land government system excludes Indigenous people from decision making with respect to land allocation and development. And instead, Indigenous nations are required to establish Aboriginal title to their own land, which, even as absurd as it sounds, was a title only permissible following the Calder case. And this Aboriginal title right that they have to establish, it was only protected under the charter following Delgamuukw, the case of Delgamuukw. And yeah, so that's not okay. So what can we do to step forward? Canada needs to first honor all of its treaties and give back the land to its rightful owners, the Indigenous nations. Indigenous people should also have a say in its allocation of land, and they should be able to limit industrial activities, developments, and any ecosystem damages occurring on their lands, because it's their right. So I'm going to shift the conversation to a little bit of a sadder note, and this is about the history of residential schools and burial sites and the unmarked graves that have been reoccurring recently. So if we look at the symbol on the wampum belt, it's a school, and this represents residential schools. They're institutions that for hundreds of years have torn Indigenous nations and families apart. From the 1870s until 1996, around 150,000, if not more, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were placed in residential schools across Canada, often against their parents' will. In these schools, children were prohibited from speaking their own native language and participating in their culture. So what happened over time? These children lost their Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous identities. The harm doesn't end there, however. Children attending residential schools, they experienced physical and emotional abuse. They lived in poor housing conditions and were malnourished and were not even given enough to eat. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even, nearly 3,200 people died from residential schools, and 1/3 of these deaths were not reported. More recently, in May of 2021, 125 children were found in unmarked burial sites in British Columbia, near where the Kamloops residential school was placed. And that same year, in Western Canada, nearly 1,000 more unmarked graves were found at residential school sites. So, although we continue to hear about Indigenous children's graves being found, not one person has been brought to justice for these murders. Evidently, we have to address this issue. First, we must support Indigenous people's right to self-determination and allow them to have self-governance. And we must create a space for Indigenous narratives within schools. Indigenous survivors should be able to go into schools and share their stories and share their narratives, because this is what will deconstruct oppressive ideologies and break down those barriers to Indigenous language learning and Indigenous learning in general. Finally, no less important, we must create a national residential school death registry to allow families to honor their loved ones and seek closure. Finally, I want to make mention of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children and the violence against Indigenous people that continues to occur. Indigenous nations face very high and disproportionate rates of missing and murdered women and children because of colonization and our justice system. So how is this issue reflected? Well, if you look on the wampum belt, there's shoes. And these small sets of shoes, they're under the rain, and they reflect the past sorrows for all the lives lost because of violence against Indigenous women and children. But there's a symbol of power here. They're on top of the land, and this reflects decolonization and Indigenous people seeking justice and taking back their lands and seeking, justice for all the lives lost. So how can we move forward? It involves a call for nationwide listening. We must listen and we must learn to improve our current law enforcement responses and ensure their safety. We mustn't simply educate ourselves, as Amanda Young stated, but we should converse and utilize social platforms. I'm afraid our time has come to an end, but just to sum up, the Royal Proclamation Wampum Belt, as of 2022, demonstrates our need for reconciliation. However, we cannot achieve such a goal without taking accountability, and yes, that includes you, Mr. Justin Trudeau. This weak and futile relationship between Indigenous nations and Canada needs to be strengthened and it will not occur unless we implement these calls to action. Thank you.